Welcome, everyone. My name is Amanda Fader. I am a G1 oncologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I have the honor of being the current president of the Society of Gynecologic Oncology, and it is such an honor to be here today to speak to you from an SGO perspective, or society, that's our acronym for Society of Gynecologic Oncology, on updates in ovarian cancer trends, funding, policy, and research. And I just want to send a very warm hug and thank you to Audra, Tracy, Sarah, and everyone at the OCRA. It's just such an incredible organization, and the SGO loves the OCRA, and we love partnering with you. So thank you again for this opportunity. And these are my disclosures. So today we have a bit of a whirlwind talk to kind of go over a lot of it's a bit of a smorgasbord of a talk today where we're going to discuss some ovarian cancer incidence and survival trends. And when I say ovarian cancer, I also mean fallopian tube and peritoneal cancers, but just difficult to say all three. We're going to review SGO and some of OCRA's important policy advocacy work and how we scientifically train the next generation of researchers and clinical trialists. Our role in education leadership in ovarian cancer, and discuss the importance of precision-based or molecular medicine and how much that has really advanced the field of ovarian cancer and benefited our patients and previvors. And I'm going to give just a few updates in rare ovarian cancers and talk about some prevention updates that are very, very exciting as well. So I just love the theme of this meeting, Uniting for Hope. It is such an appropriate theme. And again, the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance is just an inspiration to so many of us. I will always tell my patients when I meet them that in G1 oncology, we specialize in hope. So I think that message is very appropriate. And now more than ever, we have so much more to be hopeful about, given the radical changes in the landscape of research, our understanding of ovarian cancer, and how to better treat it so that we can realize the promise of prevention of more ovarian cancers, but also better survival outcomes for those who are diagnosed. And a lot of that has to do with science and clinical trials. And I know that there are several speakers that will be touching upon this in the conference, but this has been a decade of radical gynecologic cancer advances with more than 50 practice-changing clinical trials, and the majority of them have been in the ovarian cancer space. And these are phase 2 or phase 3 trials, so larger trials where we study standard of care treatments and compare them to standard of care plus experimental therapies that have really changed our understanding of how to treat this disease and really moved the needle. And the great news is that ovarian cancer therapies are improving and expanding. We still use chemotherapy, the standard old school chemotherapy drugs, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit in just a second. And they're among the most important medicines we still use in ovarian cancer care, but with a better understanding of the molecular profile of cancer, meaning its biology, what are the proteins and genes that really drive the cancer development that we can potentially harness and target to better treat our patients. Our knowledge about the disease is snowballing, and it's leading to an evolution of many new treatments. And many of the treatment advances in that last decade that we'll talk about are extending survival and improving quality of life for our patients. This is a great slide, and I'm sorry, this is should be a little bit bigger, and I'm sorry it looks so small here, but this is basically a timeline of over 70 years of FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, chemotherapy drug approvals in ovarian cancer. And what I want you to notice here is that on the left side of this timeline here in the gray, that goes from about 1950 to about 2000, you can see here that there weren't that many approvals that occurred. Over that sort of 50-year standpoint timeline, we only had like 10 drugs approved during that period. But flash forward now to 2005 to 2024, the last 20 years have brought, again, an incredible number of trials and successful positive trials that have led the FDA to approving new treatments. And we've had more than 16 approvals is in the last decade. A couple of those have been retracted since, but But you can see just an almost exponential improvement in the number of drugs we're doing, we're giving patients and that are approved now. And that's because the science has expanded, the funding for research has expanded, and we're doing more clinical trials to really understand the disease. And this is a slide I just don't like very much, but I still show because it shows us sort of these old school survival rates of patients based on their stage. And they were pretty sobering, right? If you had advanced stage disease, only 40% of, 20 to 40% or about 30% of women survived beyond 5 years. And this is very fortunately old news. We now see over multiple studies that the 5-year observed survival for ovarian cancer is on the rise. And that has been happening over the last 40 years. And you can see here that, again, in 1975, the overall 5-year survival rate was only about a third of patients living beyond 5 years. That improved by about 10% by 2015 and continues to improve today. And this is actually much higher for many patients now in the 60 percentile range. And so we continue to move the needle on this. This is not enough. We need every single woman doing well for many, many years. And this is really the focus of a lot of the work that's done at the OCRA and at the SGO and the Foundation for Women's Cancer, the GOG, and several other organizations that we're all working together on this problem. This is a great study that showed from 1975 to 2005, so over this sort of 30 to 40 year period, how advancements in chemotherapies and better surgery for chemotherapy really improved survival, overall survival for all women with advanced stage disease. And this, of course, is important work that was done by many, many individuals, including Dr. Robert Bristow, Dr. Deborah Armstrong, Dr. Peter Rose, and so many others who have studied this disease for many years, Dr. David Gershenson and others. And when we talk about key statistics for ovarian cancer, I want to focus again on the hope here, and we're looking forward. This is future forward thinking here. We still, unfortunately, have about 20,000 women in the U.S. who will receive a new diagnosis of ovarian, fallopian, or peritoneal cancer. And unfortunately, almost 13,000 women may die each year from this disease. But the hopeful message I really want to impart here for everyone to listen is that fewer women are dying of ovarian cancer, and that death rate has decreased by 40% since 1975. And this is likely due to better treatments, better surgeries, more tailored treatments, and we're going to talk about that one-size-fit-all paradigm not being, helpful anymore. We have to really do precise and individualized treatments for women, as well as the fact that fewer women are being diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And that incidence rate has really declined 1% to 2% from the 1990s to the mid-2010s, but has really increased even more so in the last 10 years to almost 3% per year decline. And we think that this is likely due to more use of oral contraceptives, a little bit less use of menopausal hormone therapy, but also we're going to talk a lot about salpingectomy, which is a medical term for fallopian tube removal, and why that's so important to these potential reduction rates. So let's just focus for a second now on the SGO, which is my organization. How do we focus on promoting advances in ovarian cancer? And we really do this in a multi-pronged way. We write white papers, which are sort of best in class, like what is the best treatment or the best testing that we can do and the best survivorship care we can give our patients with ovarian cancer. And you can see some little examples here of white papers that we've published recently on screening and surveillance, on how to do genetic testing and who should get genetic testing versus tumor testing, on PARP inhibitor maintenance therapy and how important that has really revolutionized ovarian cancer care. And we publish about one white paper a year on ovarian cancer. It's one of our biggest priorities at the organization. And this helps other doctors and nurses and individuals who care for women with ovarian cancer understand what is the most state-of-the-art science that we have right now, the best clinical trials to guide us in how I should treat my patients in my community. And this kind of helps level the playing field and standardize those recommendations. We also really invest heavily in research training programs, which I'll talk about in a second, to train the next generation of ovarian cancer researchers. This is something the OCRA is tremendous at as well, so really role modeling that on all levels. We do a ton of policy advocacy, as does OCRA, and we do this on Capitol Hill. We go to the Hill and talk to our congressional partners there. We talk to the FDA, the National Cancer Institute, the NIH, and the CDC to make sure our voices are heard. And we do this in partner with our wonderful patient advocates because, frankly, congressional folks, congressmen and women and senators want to hear from patients more than they want to hear from people like me. So it's really nice to go together and give the patient perspective as well as the medical and scientific perspective about what we need to be more successful in helping our patients. We're also promoting really groundbreaking science at our annual meeting. We have an annual meeting every March. This year it's in March 14th through 17th in Seattle. We'd love to see you all there. We have all patient advocates are welcome. And I think we had over 300 patient advocates come to our meeting last year. And then we love partnering with wonderful organizations like the OCRA. We're going to have more impact on the field with partnerships. And one of this is my presidential theme this year at SGO, multiply your impact. And you can see the hour within the word your is really, really important because it really takes a village and a multidisciplinary and community-based approach to improve outcomes and eradicate, ovarian cancer. And so by focus on building extraordinary medical and science careers, by building the best cancer programs in all parts of the country, not just at the big cancer centers, but in rural and suburban settings too, and focusing on community and how we come together with community stakeholders and patient advocates during these extraordinary times we live in. That is where we're going to have the biggest impact. And I love this quote from one of our colleagues, Cynthia Licavoli, who's a nurse at the National Cancer Institute and NRG Oncology, that's one of our cooperative groups where we perform clinical trials in GYN cancers. And she says, ending cancer as we know it means commitment to research, commitment for funding, commitment to participate, and commitment from researchers. Working together makes a difference. And this is so true. And so supporting organizations like the OCRA really help us get there because that is where you have the centralized support and then the stakeholder relationships develop from there to really bring the best people together in science and industry and government, in the community, and from the patient side as well to make a difference. And so one of the ways we do that at the SGO is we developed a program called the Bridges Research Initiative, and we now do this in partnership with the Gynecologic Oncology Foundation, which is one of the largest clinical trials networks in the world, making a real difference for our patients, as well as with the Foundation for Women's Cancer. Our foundation and the OCRA is a huge partner in this. And this is basically training the next generation of trialists who will lead ovarian cancer trials. And Dr. Sarah Adams from New Mexico, Tom Herzog from Cincinnati, and I sort of co-lead this program. And I know that there's a separate talk about this that Dr. Adams put together, and I think it's available on demand. I would really encourage you to watch it. It's inspiring to see. I just want you to know how passionate we all are, and that this next generation of physicians and scientists is so dedicated to the mission of eradicating ovarian cancer and improving outcomes for patients. In fact, this was our first cohort of over 30 young, very talented scholars, and more than 65% of the trials that were developed in this first cohort were ovarian cancer trials. So we have a real focus on that, and again, thank the OCRA for that. I've already mentioned the GOG Foundation and Energy Oncology. These are the big groups from the National Cancer Institute and from the GOG that help us with the really big hundreds of patients international trials that can change standard of care. This is where those PARP inhibitor trials were done, and so many other important trials that we're doing in the ovarian cancer space. But it takes funding to do great science and move us forward. And so there's a number of different ways that researchers obtain funding. And this is one of the things we most avidly advocate for on Capitol Hill. And in fact, you may not know this, but the Department of Defense is one of the greatest supporters of the federal government of ovarian cancer research. And this is something in that the SGO and OCRA and Foundation for Women's Cancer have really advocated for more than 2 decades. In 2008, they have this program called the Ovarian Cancer Research Academies. And in 2008, they funded us at, $10 million a year for that, which you might think, oh my gosh, that's chump change, right? To be able to come up with cures and better treatments. And you're right, and it wasn't enough. And we've all kept advocating and advocating. And by the next year, it was doubled. And then by 2024, it was more than doubled again. But 45 million, we're not satisfied with that. But the science that's coming out of this is some of the current scholars in the Ovarian Cancer Academy are some of the brightest minds in the field. These are PhDs or doctor PhDs who either run clinical trials or do science in a lab. And some of these are just wonderful colleagues in G1 oncology who are really dedicated to this. I'm thrilled that Dr. Adams and I just received, there's a brand new mechanism at the DoD now called the Ovarian Cancer Clinical Trial Academy Award, and this is to train the next generation of clinicians or people who do clinical science and trials. The other academy I just showed you was bench work, what we call lab science or translational science that helps fuel those discoveries that we then take to the clinic and study in humans and eventually in specific populations like ovarian cancer survivors. And so we're leading this new mechanism here and are going to invite the first group of scholars to join us in 2025. And we're going to be building those bridges and trying to multiply our impact some with, I'm going to go back to that theme a couple times, with the DoD Ovarian Cancer Academy and bring the scientists from the lab together with the clinicians at the hospitals so we can, really accelerate our impact together. The OCRA, again, I just can't say enough good things, really invests tens of millions of dollars in promising research and really fund innovative research, that kind of groundbreaking stuff that's high risk, high reward, as does our foundation at the SGO, the Foundation for Women's Cancer. And so through federal grants and government and foundation grants, this is how we move the needle. However, on the downside, the National Cancer Institute, which is absolutely wonderful, unfortunately, we've seen a decrease in funding and number of trials in ovarian cancer and other gynecologic cancers over the last decade due to some need for consolidation of certain trial groups. And so we really have a lot of work to do here. And this is one of my colleagues, Dr. Ryan Spencer from the University of Wisconsin, and he wrote a really important paper about the funding to lethality measures for National Cancer Institute funding for cancers. And what that means is the amount of funding a research area receives according to how lethal the cancer is or how much of a negative impact it has on a population. And so the three cancers, what he found in his work was the three cancers with the highest funding to lethality ratio were breast, prostate, and melanoma, all incredibly important cancers to support. However, their lethality scores, even though they were 1, 2, 3 in funding, were 12, 17, and 16 among all the cancers. Meanwhile, ovary, uterus, and cervix ranked 12th, 15th, and 13th in funding, but were 5th, 13th, and 6th in terms of lethality. So it really seems like it's a little backwards here. And this is a really important thing you can also advocate for with your congressional partners and with the NCI. This is a huge advocacy fight we have right now going on in terms of increasing that funding for the patients who need it the most so that we can really flip the switch on outcomes here. We just had our annual, we have both virtual and in-person sessions that we do on Capitol Hill. We just had our virtual session this past Wednesday, the 18th, and we had almost 50 SGO members and patient advocates together representing 26 states who met and had 77 congressional meetings. We met about all of these things that we were talking about. This is some of my colleagues here doing that on Wednesday. And a couple months ago, I went in person and banged on several doors. I had some great meetings with several of our senators and congressional people and their staff to talk a lot about funding for ovarian and endometrial cancer research, as well as chemotherapy drug shortages. And I'm going to pivot to that right now One of the things I'm very passionate about, and the SGO continues to be passionate about, is ensuring that we have enough essential medicines for our patients so that you have enough to worry about without having to worry about a drug shortage or a supply shortage. It's crazy. And as many may know, in 2023, we had one of the worst chemotherapy shortages in US history. And so recently on September 8th, we observed National Essential Medicine Shortage Day, and again had many congressional meetings about this, because although things are much better now, we still have a long way to go. And we're very avidly asking, and thank you to the OCRA who's doing this as well, to have Congress pass legislation to prevent chemotherapy shortages, authorizing the FDA to have more authority over regulation of manufacturers who aren't meeting the bill, providing incentives to manufacturers and hospitals to buy quality products, and also working with the FDA, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. We also met with them to talk about NIH reform. The National Institutes of Health is the largest, it's one of perhaps the most prestigious research institution in the world. And it's where the National Cancer Institute lives. And some of the most exciting science in modern times was initiated at the NIH. And so we really want to make sure we're continuing to support the NCI to make sure they get the funding we need so we can have the trials and the science that our patients deserve. This is our chemotherapy shortages team at Hopkins. It takes a village. Not at Hopkins. I'm at Hopkins at SGO, excuse me. Again, the problem with some of the recent shortages that continue in some fronts is that these older generic drugs are very cheap to manufacture. They're almost all manufactured overseas, and the return on investment isn't high for the manufacturers of these drugs. So basically, a few companies are investing in doing this. And so with this consolidated market, that's one of the issues that happened that caused this perfect storm last year of chemotherapy shortages. And fortunately, a lot of them have been resolved. I want to reassure you that the drugs that you need right now to treat ovarian cancers are available. But this has only been improved in the short term, and so we're really advocating at the SGO for long-term solutions and continuing to advocate for reform. And one of the ways we're doing that is working with the FDA to make sure all of the most important chemo drugs get put on what's called the FDA Essential Medicine List. And this, you might know, is a list that I think started in COVID during the pandemic, to make sure that there was emergency access to, vaccines and to other important drugs, that are needed, that are used commonly, antibiotics and things like that. But believe it or not, there's no modern day chemotherapies on this list, and these are some of the most life-saving these are drugs that help cure and save lives. And so we're working really closely to continue to advocate for that, as well as a number of other solutions. So let's pivot now to treatment advances. And interesting, as we talk about chemotherapy shortages, I guess one of the good things is that in some cases, and certainly for some ovarian cancers, more cancers are being treated without chemotherapy. And there was this really great article in the New York Times 3 years ago, and I have a link here if you wanted to check it out. But it was basically a growing number of cancer patients, especially those with like breast and lung and prostate cancers and even melanomas, are being spared these treatments in favor of other options. And the reason for that is we're learning a lot more about what these tumors respond to. And for some ovarian cancers, they're exquisitely responsive to chemotherapy. Like high-grade serous ovarian cancer is going to be really responsive in most cases, especially in the upfront setting to chemotherapy, whereas other slower-growing tumors may not be as responsive. And we're also learning about the mutations, the DNA, basically errors in the DNA, our genetic makeup in cells, and our, again, molecular profile, the hidden proteins and genes that basically drive the cancer's growth and success, if you will, and how we can shut those genes and proteins down or block them or alter them in some way in order to get an upper hand on the cancer. And so some of those cancers that are much more slow growing include things like low-grade serous ovarian cancer, granulosa cell cancers, low-grade endometrioid cancers. These are relatively indolent growth patterns with what's called low mitotic activity. They don't replicate or divide themselves into more cells very quickly, and they're much more likely to express certain proteins and genes as well as hormone receptors like estrogen and progesterone, which are the two most important hormones our ovaries make, than other cancer subtypes. And so we can really potentially leverage this. And through advancements in molecular medicine and precision medicine, we've learned so much more about ovarian cancer. We've learned more about hereditary cancer syndromes, well beyond women with BRCA genetic mutations, right? There's over 25 different, genes now identified, and there's more coming that are associated with ovarian cancer or with breast cancers. There are predictive markers in tumors that we can now perform something called next-gen sequencing and study to understand what are the molecular alterations in tumors that we can target with drugs and potentially, again, halt the tumor in their tracks. Now we're looking more also at circulating tumor DNA as taking blood tests to find not the tumor cells themselves, but the genetic makeup of the tumor, their DNA fragments, to see if we can detect cancer in different ways than with the usual CT scan, CA125s, and clinical exams. And when we put all of this sort of together and use biomarker discovery and pharmacogenomic markers and molecular profiling of our patients' tumors, we can intervene earlier with treatments that are more likely to be successful in patients. We can realize the promise of more personalized medicine and accelerate these novel treatment approaches in more of our patients. And so as we think about rare tumors and what's going on there, we know for sure that it's super old news that a one-size-fits-all strategy where everyone should just get carbotaxol up front, is just not in vogue anymore. We've learned so much more about this in the last 15 years and have moved beyond that. And with precision-based, molecularly directed treatments, this is a vibe. This is a vibe that is here to stay and is I think one of the number one things that's helping us really improve and see improved survival and better and even better quality of life outcomes in our patients. So let's get back to that question of cancer without chemotherapy. I'll give you breast cancer as an example. In the last 25 years, there's been a radical evolution in breast cancer treatment. The National Cancer Institute and other national guidelines 25 years ago recommended chemotherapy for the vast majority of patients with high risk or advanced stage breast cancers. But after really getting to understand, scientists understanding the molecular basis of the disease and the development of treatments to target those molecular markers, we created scoring systems to understand which patients would respond better to which types of treatments. And it really began a shift in the treatment paradigm. And now many patients with breast cancers, as you know, may have hormone receptor positive tumors, just like in ovarian cancer. So that estrogen or progesterone receptors. Some women have a marker called HER2, which is a epidermal growth factor that's on the surface of cells. And we can target all of those receptors now. And now it's more in vogue to give sequential hormonal therapy, or what we call endocrine therapy, to target those receptors than necessarily to give chemotherapy in those patients. And that has really revolutionized that care. We are doing the same thing in ovarian and in some cases endometrial cancers too, using some of these same endocrine therapies that have been studied much longer in the breast cancer patient literature and studying them in our patient populations. And we're doing that because, as you can see, this is a table of women with high-grade serous ovarian cancer, the most common type of epithelial ovarian cancer, as well as low-grade serous ovarian cancer. And you can see from this table, there's a lot of differences here in terms of how atypical or weird the cells look under the microscope, how quickly they replicate themselves, and what mutations that they express in the tumors. And so we've really got to harness that in order to best treat these tumors. I'm a low-grade serous girl. Dr. David Gershenson and I have been working together, and he's one of my mentors and just an incredible pioneer in this space. And we've done several studies together looking at what's different about women with like low-grade serous carcinomas And we know that, a really strong upfront surgery where we try to get all the disease out is very important in these patients because they don't respond as well to chemotherapies. And we've learned that if you add hormone therapy or endocrine therapy, such as a letrozole, which is a pill that's commonly used in this space, either to chemotherapy treatment after surgery, you give it after chemo and surgery, or you just do the letrozole by itself after a big surgery in patients with advanced stage disease, that those patients may do a lot better than those who just get the standard carbotaxol chemotherapy. And right now, Dr. Gershenson and I are very honored to lead a large international clinical trial. This is one of the first clinical trials in the world that was done in patients in the newly diagnosed setting for low-grade serous ovarian cancer, where we're trying to study, do you give chemo? Is chemo important here is the question. Do you give chemo followed by the letrozole treatment, or can you just do the letrozole treatment after surgery, just like we do in the breast cancer world, where they have moved away from chemo and are doing more endocrine therapies? And this is one of the first trials that's been developed that doesn't have carbotaxol in one of the treatment arms. So it's a big step forward. We've enrolled about 86% of our patients to date. We have about 55 patients left to enroll. And over the next few years, we hope to be able to give patients an answer about this so we can right-size the treatment for our women. In the same way, we're looking at adding things to endocrine therapies, like something called CDK4/6 inhibitors, which are important enzymes that help regulate cell growth. And by combining these in breast cancer, they were much more effective than just doing the endocrine therapy like letrozole by itself. And this has been studied at MD Anderson Cancer Center in women with low-grade serous cancer, and it's being studied in endometrioid cancers and others to really understand if you combine hormone therapy with a CDK4/6 inhibitor, even before surgery, when patients have really a lot of tumor and it's difficult to do surgery, what can we see? And in this small pilot trial where they did not give any patient carbotaxol, they saw a 60% response rate in patients before they went for their debulking surgeries. And one of those patients had a complete response at surgery. It was remarkable. And the other 40% had stable disease. Their disease did not get worse during that time. And so that resulted in about 100% benefit for all of those patients. So they're now trying to study and expand these trial results to see, can we again eliminate chemotherapy altogether in patients and have a better outcome and great quality of life. One way to study ovarian cancers, and especially rare cancers, is by doing what are called platform or basket trials, where you can, instead of just studying one type of ovarian cancer and one drug or two drugs and comparing them to one another, you have multiple different types of ovarian cancer being studied, and you're depending on what their molecular profile looks like, what those mutations look like, there's 11 to 12 different treatment options that a patient can enroll to. And this is a much more efficient way to study multiple new treatments and to make sure that, again, we're realizing that promise of precision medicine, getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And so this is called the Bouquet trial. I love this name. And Dr. Gershenson and Jubilee Brown head this up. This is an international trial that's actually headed by Isabelle Gray-Coquard in France, but the U.S. Leaders are listed on the slide. And this is open at many different centers across the country. And so we're very excited to see the results of this trial. So one of the most exciting new types of drugs that have really become in vogue in the last 5 years are antibody drug conjugates. And these are basically drugs that have three components. They have an antibody, a linker, and then a drug. And the antibody is usually a highly selective monoclonal antibody that will attach to a very specific protein, or what's called antigen, on the tumor, with less, and will do less so on normal cells. And then it's attached to a potent cytotoxic agent. Cytotoxic agents is just a fancy word for chemo, designed to be introduced into the cell and target cell death of the cancer cell. And then there's a linker that kind of connects the two and basically helps release that chemotherapy drugs into the target cells. And one of the most interesting and exciting ADCs in ovarian cancer that many of you may have heard of is Elahere or mirvetuximab soravtansine. And this is for patients who have folate receptor alpha positive platinum-resistant epithelial ovarian fallopian tube or peritoneal cancer. And this is one of the first drugs that was approved in the modern era for patients with platinum-resistant disease. And there's just a huge need for more drugs in this space. And in this trial where they compared this drug, mirvetuximab, that was given every 3 weeks, to physician's choice chemo, and so things like Taxol or Doxil or topotecan were given. Both the response rate in terms of tumor shrinkage, the time that the tumor didn't progress or get worse, called progression-free survival, and the overall survival were all significantly better in the patients who got the ADC, the mirvetuximab. So, and this is in patients who had at least 75% expression of folate receptor alpha in their cells. And so it's really important to get molecular testing done for your tumors, to potentially do it early and often, because tumors can change and mutate, and that can really help drive the best treatments for patients. Another really wonderful example of an antibody drug conjugate that's really changing our treatment paradigms is called trastuzumab deruxtecan. And so this is, it's also known as Enhertu. And these are results from the Destiny Pan-Tumor02 study, which, again, this was one of those platform trials where you have multiple tumors being tested. And in this case, where they were being tested with one drug, this trastuzumab deruxtecan, and these were for patients who had tumors that expressed that HER2 protein we were talking about earlier that's common in patients with breast cancer and some endometrial cancers and ovarian cancers. And when the tumor expressed either a medium amount or a high amount of this protein, they were eligible for this trial and had this antibody drug conjugate given. And what you can see, about 40 patients with ovarian cancer were enrolled, and it was pretty exciting data. So for patients who were high expressors of the HER2 protein, almost 65% of patients had an excellent response, with several of them having a complete response. That tumor melted away. Most patients had what's called a partial response, but even in those who didn't respond, 35% had stable disease. So basically, again, it halted the tumor in its tracks for several months or more. And that can be a win-win too, if we can prevent tumor growth from occurring. And so, and many of these responses were durable, meaning they lasted quite some time. And so we're very excited about this. It's being studied further in ovarian cancer, but this, getting tested for HER2 is another opportunity for patients who may have had a lot of other treatments to get, again, that right size treatment at the right time. And I'm going to end with talking a little bit about hereditary cancer genetics and the salpingectomy story, the removal of the fallopian tubes. So we're going to end on a high note with prevention here, because, we as GYN oncologists, we live to help our patients live better lives. That's what we do. It's even more exciting when we can help a patient prevent a cancer altogether. And I know that you all understand that. And there's just been such a revolution in not only molecular testing, but in hereditary cancer genetic testing from the early 1900s and 1960s, when, Dr. Henry Lynch first identified some of the genes that were responsible for colon cancer and uterine and ovarian cancers, to the modern era in the 1990s, when Mary Claire King and others, identified the BRCA genes. And now, we have so many mutations that we've identified. And what's really good about that now is it's not just about knowing what your risk is for a cancer. We now have emergence of targeted and directed therapies for patients who have some of these markers. Either genetically they inherit them, or their tumors express some of these markers. And some of those include PARP inhibitors. And I know there's a couple of other speakers who are going to be talking about PARP inhibitors, so I'm not going to go into this too much. But PARP inhibitors have revolutionized how we treat ovarian cancer, especially in the upfront setting, with those patients expressing either the BRCA gene as a hereditary marker or in their tumors, or something called HRD, homologous recombination deficiency, really benefiting, especially from PARP inhibitors, where it sometimes extends life by several years. We have to be careful how long we use PARP inhibitors because, like many of the chemotherapies and targeted therapies we use, they are associated with side effects. And so we usually recommend only continuing them for 2 years, as long as a patient is benefiting from them. Okay. And I love that sometimes we get the opportunity to go in together with OCRA on consensus statements, or to endorse statements that others have made, including the OCRA. And this is a really important statement about ovarian cancer screening and symptom awareness, and just really the reality that, unfortunately, although we've had such a huge focus on screening ovarian cancer, it's a very difficult disease to screen for because there are no symptoms of early disease in most cases, and the reality of identifying these cancers early, since they're very invasive and would require invasive techniques, since it's not like doing a mammogram or a Pap smear where you can actually visualize and feel the organ of interest. It's become more elusive, and so there's been a huge interest by researchers, including some of my own wonderful colleagues at Johns Hopkins that I'll introduce in just a second, on understanding leveraging our basic understanding of ovarian cancer and what's called the tubal hypothesis now, that the majority of the serous ovarian and peritoneal cancers are actually seeded from cancer cells from the fallopian tube epithelium. In other words, that most ovarian cancers may not be ovarian at all. They may be fallopian tube cancers. Really leveraging that to help prevent cancer is, I think, one of our greatest assets we have in the prevention space. And so we know that 20% of ovarian cancers are caused by a genetic mutation. It's really important for all women and men, not just women, to know their risks, because men can also pass along the BRCA gene, and women can pass along the BRCA gene to their daughters and sons, not just to their daughters. And so there's lots of cancers that that awareness needs to be made of about that. But what I want to say about the fallopian tube theory is that we think that about 70% of the most common and lethal ovarian cancers begin in the fallopian tubes. And research has shown that removing fallopian tubes when having other pelvic surgery, such as hysterectomy or wanting to get your tubes tied and keep your ovaries, for example, can help prevent ovarian cancer. And there's many clinical trials studying this question right now, including in the US, the Energy Oncology SOROC trial, which compares 2 surgical procedures in women with the BRCA1 mutations to assess whether women could just undergo removal of the fallopian tubes and preserve those important ovaries that produce hormones that do. The ovaries are amazing organs. Unfortunately, things can go awry with the ovaries, as we know, but they produce hormones that are so critical to so many functions in our bodies and that impact our quality of life. And so this is really important study is going to find out in the highest risk women, can they safely undergo just fallopian tube removal instead of removal of the ovaries and fallopian tubes, which is the conventional or standard of care approach to reducing ovarian cancer in high risk women. So it's really important to know your risk. There's a variety of genes from BRCA, BRIP, PALB, RAD51C and D, Lynch syndrome, STK11, and many other genes that are associated with a hereditary risk of ovarian cancer. So genetic testing is really critical there. Other studies are really focused on salpingectomy or removal of the tubes at an earlier time point, but then eventually removing the ovaries, but delaying that removal so that you can keep those hormones and reduce that risk of early menopause sort of early on. And someone who's really done a lot of this work is Dr. Karen Liu, formerly at MD Anderson, now at Moffitt Cancer Center. And she helped lead a trial called WISPS, the Women Choosing Surgical Prevention, which is a prospective multi-center trial to really understand the quality of life impact of and sexual function impact of patients who had their ovaries versus just their tubes removed, because quality of life is important, and we needed to understand, is there a benefit there? And what she found in her study, and she did this again with the University of Washington and several others, is that women who had their tubes only removed were less likely to go into menopause, less likely to have problems with sex, fewer problems with cognitive function, and so they studied this menopausal symptom checklist of all of the menopause symptoms a woman might feel, and there was a significantly higher risk of severe menopause symptoms and lower quality of life in patients who had their ovaries removed instead of just their tubes. And that then led to what's called the TUBA-WISP-2 trial, which is ongoing right now, which is an international trial to determine the cancer prevention efficacy of indicated salpingectomy, so removing the tubes because you have a high risk of ovarian cancer or fallopian tube cancer, and then delayed ovarian removal, and the safety of that. And they need about 3,000 women. This is an international trial. They've already enrolled almost 2,000 women. And so I'm really excited to see the results of this trial. Another important colleague who's doing great work in the prevention space is Jessica McAlpine and her team in British Columbia and Canada. And they were able to work with the government, to really socialize having the salpingectomy performed when women were undergoing other gynecologic procedures like hysterectomy or removal of an ovarian cyst in women who no longer desired to have future children and wanted to have permanent contraception. And they'd studied patients. This was a really important paper that was published in 2022. And they studied a cohort of more than 50,000 patients, half of which underwent the fallopian tube removal at that surgery, and then half underwent hysterectomy alone or just had their tubes tied. And what was very exciting to see is there were no ovarian cancers that developed in the individuals who had their fallopian tubes removed, which was significantly lower than the age-adjusted expected rate of ovarian cancers in that group. So it was really exciting initial data. Our colleagues in Denmark and Sweden are also studying this. And I really want to give a shout out to one of my friends and colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Rebecca Stone, who's just a rock star. And she, along with Karen Liu and Dr. Carol Long-Roche at Memorial Sloan Kettering, are taking this one step further. They're saying, guys, if removing fallopian tubes reduces the risk of ovarian cancer, why are we just doing this for gynecologic surgeries? Why aren't we offering this to more women when they're having other common abdominal surgeries, like, for example, getting your appendix or your gallbladder out, which are some of the most common surgeries a woman might undergo that are non-gynecologic. And so they have this wonderful grant from Breakthrough Cancer Foundation, and they're studying ways for how to not only socialize this across all, bringing surgical disciplines together and making surgery less siloed. So GYN oncologists are talking to general surgeons, are talking to urologists, are talking to, gastric and hepatobiliary surgeons to kind of really reduce the risk of ovarian cancer on an even higher level. They're also studying with cool AI and bioengineering ways to better study the molecular characteristics of the fallopian tube when we do these surgeries. Where are those precancers? Like, what do those precancers look like? And which of those lesions that we find in the fallopian tube when doing these surgeries are going to lead to cancer and which aren't, that we don't need to worry about? And so this is really innovative and exciting work, and really looking forward to that. So I'm going to end by just again on the message of hope, that which is what we specialize in at the OCRA, at the SGO, and with all of you, that ovarian cancer incidence mortality is on the decline. And this is huge. Again, 40 to 50% reduction in mortality in the last 40 years because of all of these reasons we've talked about today. It's not enough, and I'm not suggesting it is, but there is hope that we are moving in the right direction through molecular medicine, through great clinical trials, through the development of novel treatments, and through exciting prevention opportunities so we can just reduce the risk of this darn cancer altogether. We're really heading in a really exciting direction. But there's a huge focus as well, a major, and perhaps the biggest focus now is on women who are already diagnosed or who are yet to be diagnosed, so we can help those patients live longer and better lives. And I'd like to end with this quote by Bill Gates. Karen Liu gave me this. We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And the last decade has just been unbelievable time with so many changes in treatment options and outcomes. And it's a very a meaningful time to be an ovarian cancer researcher and a doctor and physician who's privileged to care for patients with ovarian cancer. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Thank you for all you're doing to work and partner with us to help you and to help other women move the needle on these cancers. And I'm happy to share any of my slides. And again, want to just thank the amazing OCRA team for this wonderful opportunity today.